Okay, trying to stay in order. We're in section 3, Paleo Rome. Part 1 was the 1st century. Part 2 is the 2nd century. We're in part 3, 3rd century. We just seen chapter 1 about the Servian dynasty, and we are starting chapter 2. We actually started in the last video, Crisis in the 3rd century, or we call it Barrack emperors. Now, Barrack emperors means they were chosen and supported by the army. After the assassination of Emperor Alexander in 235 by his own troops, who then chose their immediate commander, Maximinus Thrax, this started the first so-called Barrack emperor. The last Barrack emperor was Gallienus in 285. Now, from 235 to 285, we will see 28 emperors, and only 2 died of natural death from the plague. In addition, there were 38 usurpers. Successful usurpers were usually governors commanding large groups of legions or prefects of the guard controlling Rome. When an emperor died, not all provinces accepted the successor. The claimant would gather his army and march to Rome to contest the throne. Believe it or not, legionaries disliked fighting their brothers in arms, and battles between legions did not happen as much as possibly could have because the soldiers would often kill their commanders. The success of the usurper would be totally dependent on the loyalty of the troops. The main factors that decided whether the army would kill their commanders would be dependent on 1. Monetary prize, and 2. The capability of success of the commander in winning their battles. The legion's trust in their commander's ability to win was huge and necessary. If one of these factors were apparent, then mutiny would occur and result in the death of the commander. The usurper also had to be a man of charismatic character to avoid any doubts in his ranks. Now, there were a few planned murders of emperors directed more at the establishment than the person. No matter what, however, the new emperor was always in a fragile position and thus usually put trusted men in position to help them out. These were usually family members. So the murders and assassinations that we're going to look at here will all be the result of one of these reasons. Now, we looked at some of these Barrack emperors already in the last video, but here's a more chronological, brief look at them all. So we're starting here with Maximinus. He was proclaimed the new emperor by Alexander's men in 235, which kicked off the Barrack emperors. Now, the Senate, who opposes the provincial armies and who is in disarray with the Praetorian Guards, they all dislike each other. They appoint 2 emperors, which were Gordian I and Gordian II. However, Gordian I killed himself within 3 weeks upon hearing about the death of his son at the Battle of Numantia. So the Senate ended up selecting 2 new co-rulers, Pupienus and Balbinius, to oppose Maximinus. Now, Pupienus marched to take the field against Maximinus, while Balbinius stayed in Rome to maintain order. But in this he failed miserably, for the Praetorians revolted, and this resulted in much bloodshed and a considerable part of the city burned to ashes. Maximinus, he ended up being murdered in 238 by his troops. So Pupienus marched back to Rome in triumph without winning a battle. Now, both emperors then were planning on new campaigns, and on the eve of their departure, there was a festival going on. The Praetorian Guards broke into the palace and dragged both emperors through the streets and put them to death. So from 235 to 238, we've already seen 3 emperors being murdered, 1 killed in battle, and 1 committed suicide. Now, the next emperor would be proclaimed Gordian III by the Senate. Now, we already seen him in the last video. He ruled from 238 to 244, and he was killed by King Shapur. Then came Philip's, the Arab's reign in 244. And this reign of Philip the Arab officially marks the start of the barbarian invasions. Now, in 249, Philip was slain in battle by Decius, who now becomes the new emperor, and he rules from 249 to 251. And he was killed in the battle against the Goths. Remember, he was the first emperor being killed by barbarians. Now, all this was talked about in the last video. But Decius' son, Hostilian, he took over, and he died in just a few months from the plague. So the new emperor is now Gallus. And during his reign, the Goths renewed their attacks. In 253, the armies of Boeotia ended up proclaiming Aurelian emperor. And so Gallus needed to deal with the barbarian invasions and Aurelian, and so he called for Valerian from the Rhine to help him defeat Aurelian. But Gallus was murdered by his own troops in 253 before Valerian even arrived. Aurelian becomes the new emperor over Gallus, but Valerian ends up coming to fight the usurper. But Aurelian was assassinated by his troops. So Valerian takes over in 253, and he rules to 260 now. And he appoints his son to help him out as co-ruler. Now, we already saw Valerian was captured by King Shapur in the last video. It's his son, who we will go into a little detail here, who's the next great emperor. Now you can see why this is called the Crisis of the 3rd century. The barbarian invasion started all up and down the Rhine and the Danube. The Persians were trying to take Mesopotamia and Syria back. There were usurpers. The emperors were dying one a year. And so you need a great emperor to come along. And this was Emperor Gallienus, who helped keep the empire from collapsing. Now, he ruled with his father from 253 to 260. He then took over as sole ruler from 260 to 268. His 15-year reign was the longest in half a century. Now, Gallienus had appointed his commander, Gallienus, to stop a Sarmatian invasion in the Pannonia area, which he did. He was also charged with the military education of his son. But when his son had died in 258, the circumstances of this was uncertain, but his position became perilous. He had no choice but to proclaim himself emperor. So Gallienus reacted quickly, and he defeated Gallienus at the Battle of Barca. Now, this was the first win for Gallienus. Now, between 260 and 262, there were 7 usurpers that laid claim to the throne that he had to deal with. Besides the barbarians, economic conditions were collapsing in the interior, and inflation was running uncontrolled in Rome. Eastern provinces were lost to the control of King Odenathus of Palmyra, and in 260, Postumus, a commander of the Rhine legions, rebelled and took control of France, Britain, and Spain. Now, remember I said there was different factions warring with each other, and Gallienus was forced to prevent senators in Rome from holding command because many times they were aiding the usurpers against him. And then the biggest invasion of the Goths to date happens, and they ran all the way in the Balkan area and sacked Athens. Now, in 259, there was a great battle at Mytilene against the Alemanni tribe. It was reported that 300,000 men, women, and children were at this battle, and all were killed. So this is another great victory for Gallienus. Now, he held off the Goth invasion of 260. He was then forced to send his elite mobile army under Aurelian to fight the eastern usurpers after Gallienus' father, Valerian, was captured in 260. The usurper, Macranius, and his sons were killed in battle. Valerian's commander, Lucius Aemilianus in Egypt, revolted and was also defeated by Aurelian. Now, Gallienus made innovations for his frontier defense, and the elite force of the cavalry was one of his developments. He developed a force that could be described as an elite force. It was a cavalry force not committed to the frontier defense and consequently posted in one spot, but was a mobile force. Some historians credit Gallienus with possibly creating the cavalry arm as a fighting force for Rome instead of using an infantry army. They even had mounted archer cavalry from the east. Now, he was doing what modern armies are doing now. He was forming units for special purposes by drawing on existing units. And this is the force under Aurelius that defeated pretenders. Now, as far as the frontiers were concerned on the Danube and the Rhine, Gaul was overrun by the Franks and other barbarians who found out, just as the Goths had on the Danube, that once you broke through the frontier defenses, the interior was at their mercy. They pushed all the way into Spain. In 259, Postumus, the commander of the Rhine, who was a pretender to the imperial throne, we already mentioned him, he revolted against Roman authority. Now, he killed Gallienus' son and prefect, but Postumus was strangely actually procuring Roman hegemony over the invaders. He revived Gallic nationalism, and simply put, the Gauls could defend Roman civilization better than Rome could. So neither Gallienus nor his successor Claudius II interfered with Postumus' unquestionable service to the Roman cause, mainly because Gallienus had problems all along the Danube and in the east. But nevertheless, the fact was he was usurping their authority. But he demonstrated his power to repel the barbarians far better than any Roman emperor could, and thus they quietly allowed Postumus to assert his own authority over the Gallic area. Now, toward the end of Gallienus' reign, he was finally ready to advance on Postumus, but it didn't go well until Aurelius returned from the east. But Postumus, he ended up retreating deep into a city in the interior. Gallienus went and laid siege, but he was wounded and he returned to Rome. Now, it is said that Aurelius joined Postumus at this time, and he even allowed Postumus to escape. It was in 268 that his trusted, able cavalry commander Aurelius proclaimed himself emperor, and so he marched toward Rome. Gallienus met him near Mediolatium, and Gallienus defeated him and then laid siege to the city where he fled to. Now, Gallienus ends up being murdered by one of his own soldiers, which was actually a part of a conspiracy formed by some Eastern commanders and the Senate. Now, the army then proclaimed Claudius II emperor. Now, hearing of Gallienus' death, the Senate put his entire family to death. Now, Gallienus was also credited with a revival of the Renaissance in Rome, which means, basically thought, literature, philosophy. Okay, he was credited with that. And he stopped the anti-Christian persecutions that Decius had started. Now, Gallienus was killed when he was preparing to fight the Goths that invaded all the way to Athens. But at this point, Claudius II takes over, and there's a great battle at Knossos in 269. And this is the force I already mentioned, 300,000 Goths that moved into all the way down to the Balkan area there into Greece and took Athens. One Gothic force had pushed into modern Yugoslavia, and it was stricken with the plague. Claudius met these invaders here in Knossos. The hard-pressed Romans finally crushed the Goths when Claudius led 5,000 men in reserve against the enemy rear. An estimated 50,000 Goths fell that day. Claudius received the honorary title Gothicus, but before he could follow up his victory, he caught the plague and died in 270. He was never able to regain the west and controlled only the east. Claudius II's brother, Quintilius, takes over, but he died in a few weeks into his reign, either by murder or suicide. It's unknown. Now, this brings us to the next great emperor. And the reign of Gallienus is sometimes called the savior of the world, and he goes 4-0 in major battles. The next emperor is Lucius Domitius Aurelianus, and he becomes emperor in 270, and he reigns for 5 years to 275. Now, he was successful against the Danube enemies, but he was obliged to retract the frontiers in this sector, just as Gallienus and Postumus had done on the Rhine. The larger perimeter was no longer capable of being defended. Aurelian reigned for 5 years, which gave him and the empire time to recover. Now, one of his first battles were in 271 at Placentia. This was a year after he was emperor. Northern Italy was invaded by a host of the Alemanni, supported by the Jutungi and the Vandals. Aurelian hurried an army northward. The Romans reached Placentia on the Po, just ahead of the barbarians. In a fierce encounter, the Alemanni and their allies were driven back, but the Roman victory only checked the invasion. Emperor Aurelian moved to expel the barbarians from the Roman territory. He marched his legionaries 30 miles westward to Pavia. Here the Romans fought a pitched battle against the Germanic invaders. The barbarians were soundly defeated and withdrew across the Alps. To shorten Rome's far-flung frontiers, Aurelian now, and we already talked about this, he ordered the abandonment of the province of Dacia, and the boundaries were fixed on the Danube. And then he actually constructed the large defensive walls around the city of Rome. That's why these walls are called the Aurelian walls. That brings us to the Palmyrene Wars. Now remember, in the east, Odenathus, the king, he was defending the Roman provinces against Persian advances. But unlike Postumus in the west, who was a great ally in defending Gaul from barbarians, Odenathus was creating for himself a position of independence, as so the Romans believed. Now, Palmyra, in their long history, defended the trade routes. These Semitic, semi-Hellenistic communities were well qualified for sword-bearing in the east. We know already the Persian army relied extensively on heavy cavalry. The Palmyrenes used a combination of light and heavy cavalry, archers, and sophisticated siege equipment. The Palmyrenes had absorbed Roman administrative techniques, while the Persians, like their predecessors, were organized on a local feudal basis without centralized control, which prevented them from more permanent effects of their victories. Odenathus, whose dynasty was established by Septimus Severus, had inflicted a crushing defeat on the Persians, while they were still laden with plunder over the conquest of Valerian. He then suppressed overambitious survivors of Valerian's army who wanted to rule, and took over the legions himself and launched a counteroffensive in Mesopotamia. Now, there is debates as to whether the Palmyrene kings acted on their own or for the good of Rome, which is what led to these wars. Now, in 267, Odenathus' widowed wife, Zenobia, inherited his power and was very gifted as well. She showed herself independent of Gallienus and Aurelian. The emperor's officer had recovered Alexandria from the Palmyrenes before Aurelian even marched through Asia. Now that brings us to the Battle of Emesa in 272. At first, Zenobia was friendly to Rome, but now apparently she sought to establish a Syrian queendom modeled on Cleopatra's Egypt of earlier times. Aurelian moved eastward and drove Zenobian forces out of Antioch in 272. When the queen withdrew her army southward up the Orontes River, Aurelian pursued. After a chase of 100 miles, the Romans overtook the Zenobians at Emesa. Aurelian's legionnaires routed the enemy troops. Zenobia fled 75 miles eastward to take refuge within the walls of Palmyra. Now, from 272 to 273, the Emperor Aurelian followed the queen and laid siege to the city. Now, he had bought off the Bedouin forces and fought the Persians, who Zenobia was calling for help, and then he was reinforced. Now, when she realized that the city was going to fall, she tried to escape but was captured and brought to Aurelian. Zenobia was brought to Rome in chains, but ended her days married to a Roman senator. Aurelian had put a governor over Palmyra, but the citizens immediately revolted. The Roman emperor marched back to the city and slaughtered the inhabitants and reduced the city to ruins. The emperor then hurried to Gaul to put down a revolt by the legions of Eusebius Tetricus. When Aurelian squashed that revolt, he returned to Rome and he enjoyed a triumph, and he received officially the accolade Restorer of the World. Now, Aurelian was murdered while planning a campaign against Persia. He ruled from 270 to 275, and because of Gallienus and him, this is what saved the empire, basically. Now, Lucius Demetrius Aurelianus, he goes 5-0 in major victories. Now, next set of emperors after 275 would naturally come from the Danube Illyrian areas, because this was the most contested areas in the last 50 years, and this is where most of the legions were recruited from. Aurelian's death marked another sequence of short-lived emperors until 284, and this is when Emperor Diocletian arrived. Now, he's proclaimed emperor by the Eastern legions, and there was one pretender to the throne over there, and he basically had to kill him. It was not in battle, but he actually came to Diocletian to tell him that he didn't have any hand in killing the former emperor's son, which people believed he did, but it is known now that he did not. But Diocletian had a dream that if he would kill this guy, he would be the next emperor, so he basically drew his own sword right there and killed him. So, the Emperor Carus, he's campaigning in the east and he dies, and his son Numerian, which we just seen that this guy had killed the emperor's son here, and Diocletian just killed him. Now, Carus's other son, he was in control in the west, and Carinus here, he has to defeat Julianus, who was the governor of Venetia, who wanted to be emperor. He defeats him, and then when he finds out his brother's killed and Diocletian is proclaiming himself emperor, he marches over there to meet Diocletian, and he defeats Diocletian in a battle at Margus River. But it's not decisive. Diocletian is not rebelled against. His men don't kill him. They're ready to have a second battle, and then Carinus' own men kill him. And this leaves Diocletian as sole ruler of the Roman Empire in 284. And this is basically the year that we say the crisis of the 3rd century ends, because of Gallienus, because of Aurelian, and then Diocletian makes some reforms, important reforms. The crisis ends. Now, there was still barbarian invasions from the Rhine and the Danube, but the empire was more united once again. Now, what Diocletian did with his reforms was he shared power with a fellow officer, Maximian, and these two would call themselves Augusti. And then there was two other Illyrians. One was Constantine and one was Galerius, and they were named as their colleagues, and they were called Caesars. So there was 4 emperors now who watched each other's back. The East and the West were basically 2 empires in a single civilization, and Diocletian wishes they would remain collegiate, not rivals. And this basically paves the way for the Byzantine Empire. Now, Diocletian invoked hereditary as another facet to rule, because praetorianism or provincial legions was simply an invitation to mutiny or murder. Because an emperor needed to be a soldier, it was too easily assumed that he needed to be nothing else. So Diocletian made sure you had a blend of these two, which was the best result. Also, it was arranged that after 20 years, the 2 Augusti would step down, and the two Caesars would take their place, and then they would appoint two new Caesars under them. Now, Diocletian ended up retiring in 305 in Salone, which again is an important factor in Roman history. It shifts the power from Italy and Rome. Remember, we're talking about Rome already being just merely a ceremonial city, but this officially shifts the power from there to the Balkan area. And even the Senate were now regarded as no more than mere councils. Now, this ends our 3rd century. Diocletian moves us into the 4th century, which we'll talk about in the next video. Also, it was the last great persecution of Christians during his reign, and we'll touch a little bit on that also. What's really amazing is in the 3rd century here, the battles that were fought against the usurpers and for the throne were numerous Roman on Roman battles. And I don't add these to the battle record, as you know. But the battles, for the most part, every single one that was fought against the barbarian invasions, every time the emperors went up against the barbarians, they won those battles. So the Roman army was still defeating these barbarians' forces quite often, and almost every time. In the east, against the Persians, the Romans were winning most of those battles. They would lose one or two here, but they were winning most of those. So it just goes to show you that the Roman infantry fighting machine is still almost unbeatable here. They don't have enough troops to control the vast territory that they could win. They could just possibly keep winning and winning. They just don't have the manpower to control it. And with the internal squabbles going on, it's an impossibility to even try. And the Roman battle record, they win 9 major battles in this video. It goes up to 110. They lost 1. Their losses are 45, and their draws 4. And Lucius Demetrius Aurelianus, he goes 5-0. So 5 battles were won by him, and 4 were won by Gallienus. And they basically saved the Roman Empire, those 2 emperors.